my name is Gary Burgess and welcome to Holding Court, the Jersey Law Podcast. Joining me, my expert guide, partner and family law expert extraordinaire at Viberts, it's Advocate Rose Colley. Rose, good to see you.
And you, Gary.
We are going to talk about cohabitation.
We are.
In this episode. I wanted to start with something, a simple sort of fact or fiction myth buster. We hear about common law marriage.
We do.
I've heard it over the years. It's, oh, you've been together a few years, in the law, you're married, don't worry. Does it exist?
The answer is common law marriage does not exist, has never existed, and I suspect never will.
That's really interesting, but these myths perpetuate and grow.
They do, and it often means that people are caught off guard, and it also means that people don't take legal advice, and sometimes that has fairly sad consequences for them.
And when you say fairly sad consequences, what sort of practical outcomes that people don't want are you talking about?
I mean, it can have real impact in terms of, particularly in Jersey, in relation to buying property, perhaps putting money in. It can also have implications in terms of you think you're married, but then your partner dies and then you think you've got rights that you don't have. So potentially it has all sorts of implications.
So let's start at the start with what rights actually exist in the first place for cohabitees, and that could be heterosexual couples, that could be same-sex couples.
Absolutely.
So what rights do you have if you are falling short of what we'd call marriage?
I mean, the easy answer is if you're merely cohabiting, then you have absolutely no rights at all. You can do things to help you get rights to protect you. If you have children together, there's a whole area in terms of the children law, but on the face of it, you have no rights. So if you're in a relationship, he or she leaves the other, it can be horrendous to try and sort it out.
And it occurs to me, in terms of cohabitation, is it beyond couples as well? For example, there might be a group of friends who've bought a property together. They think they're cohabiting and they have protections, but the same applies there. They don't have that legal underpinning.
No, they don't. I mean, when more than two people tend to buy property, they sometimes realise that they do need to be a bit sensible about things, because for some reason they may not trust each other in the same way. But obviously when you're living with someone and for all intents and purposes you're treating them as your husband or your wife, then people tend not to be so careful. It's interestingly psychology, I think.
Absolutely. And I guess as a couple, we go into anything we do in our lives together assuming it's going to go well because we want it to go well. There's almost that confirmation bias. So on the premise that we hope for the best but prepare for the worst, what are the sort of things we should be considering from the outset? I guess just in a relationship, but then as we start bolting on things like property.
Sure, just in a relationship you can deal with all sorts of day-to-day things by what's called a cohabitation agreement, which people in fact rarely enter into, but they can deal with things like what might happen if one of them dies to life insurance, for example. If they split up, things like joint bank accounts, who pays the utility bills, all sorts of things. So it can be as simple as, in its most basic sense, I've known a number of students who have what's called a flat share agreement. So even that will give you a few rights, and then you can move, when you're in usually a sexual relationship with someone, to the cohabitation agreement. And that can be before you buy property, you don't have children, that can give you some, not only protection, but also I think some certainty in terms of what may happen if you split up or the worst happens and one of you sadly dies.
So if that document is in place and something bad happens, whether that's splitting up or worse, as you say, is it that in the eyes of the law, that document is sacred, that what you've agreed to is followed? How does that work?
Well, normally, as with things called prenups, there is this assumption that you should really take some independent legal advice and you can't be forced into signing it, so there can't be any coercion. But effectively, it's then a contract between the two of you. And it's very unlikely, as long as things remain the same, so you haven't subsequently bought property or had children, that the court would say, this is a contract that you both freely entered into as adult people, knowing that it was going to create a legal relationship between you.
And so if a separation did happen years down the line, it makes that situation, I guess, easier. I know it's not a nice situation, but there's a greater sense of clarity there.
There's a greater sense of clarity. So it can even deal with things like, I mean, several years, let's say you've been renting somewhere together for 3 or 4 years, you will have acquired possessions. It can deal with how you're going to split those things, all of that sort of practical, mundane things that people often don't think about.
And is that a big thing to do, or can that be quite a straightforward document? Are we there going through every item in our life, or can we talk in a broad brush way?
No, it can be done in a broad brush way, but it does need to deal with the main sort of headings and likelihood that the couple may eventually have to sort out.
And I guess the whole point of this is to make everything ultimately easier. I think, as we've said when we've spoken previously, so much of this is about avoiding the need for courts to get involved in processes in the first place.
Yeah, or avoiding the stress, avoiding having to get legal advice when it may be too late. So yeah.
Now, we talk about cohabitations and couples together, and we also think about marriage. But in recent years, we've got used to the phrase civil partnership, and I think people know what that is. But assume a civil partnership is for a same-sex couple. How does that work in Jersey? Is civil partnership an option for any couple?
Civil partnerships, and this is, I think, one of the debates that's been raging on here for a few years, though raging probably isn't the right word because it's then forgotten about. A civil partnership in Jersey can only be entered into by same-sex couples. So a heterosexual couple, unlike, say, in the Isle of Man, can't have a civil partnership.
That's really interesting. So their options are cohabitation, ideally with some kind of legal underpinning that they've created, or marriage.
Or marriage.
But there's nothing between the two.
And of course, it's quite an interesting debate about why would people want to enter into a civil partnership as opposed to getting married. But lots of people, apparently lots of young people, still prefer the civil partnership model because it doesn't have quite the formality, it doesn't have the religious connotation that marriage still has. So certainly one of the campaigns here over the last few years has been to try and extend civil partnerships to everybody.
And do you think there is an argument for that to happen?
Oh, absolutely, because a civil partnership will give you the same rights as if you were married.
And would that then effectively be the default option, do you think, for cohabiting couples? Do you think for those who fall short of either being ready for marriage or simply don't want to get married, it is a less steeped in tradition, however pragmatic solution?
I think so, although of course there's also been this debate in terms of should people who merely cohabit have the same rights as if they were married. But that's probably a step even further away from what we have currently.
Could we turn all this on its head, though, to say that now we have marriage where anybody can get married, any couple, whether they are same sex or opposite sex, that you just don't need civil partnerships anymore?
And again, apparently this was the argument in the Isle of Man, where they chose to retain civil partnerships and extend them, because as I've already said, lots of people like the concept of a civil partnership. They don't like what they see as an old-fashioned concept that often, as I said, has religious connotations about being married. So I think it's good to have the choice.
What's your feeling as to the direction Jersey is going? Is it the status quo and we just are where we are, or do you think it actually will change over time?
I think it's like all these things. I mean, I had some discussions with some politicians soon after the last election, and then some of these issues get lost. And of course, unfortunately, so many important social issues have been lost in the last year or so, because obviously governments had a lot of other things to do. So I think COVID in many ways has got a lot to answer for.
It's not top of the priority list given
No,
everything else. And
no.
I kind of understand that. Elsewhere in this series, we've spoken about divorce. I just wonder, are there any specific considerations now we have spoken about civil partnerships where when a civil partnership comes to an end? Well, actually, is that even called divorce? I don't know.
It's not called divorce, it's called dissolution of the civil partnership. But the process is the same. All that happened was that the matrimonial causes law was amended to include reference to civil partnerships.
So, if somebody is finding themselves in that situation, what are the initial steps they should be taking? I'm guessing someone would suggest give you a buzz for starters.
Yeah, I mean, or give any good family lawyer a buzz, but the steps are the same as if you're getting divorced. The process is more or less identical. I mean, obviously, the grounds don't include adultery because civil partnership obviously can only be between same-sex couples, and the definition of adultery doesn't work as it's currently drafted. But apart from that, you can almost take one and copy it for a civil partnership.
So, are there still areas within Jersey's legislation for same-sex couples where things haven't quite caught up in terms of discrimination and getting all the ducks in a row and making just things fair for everybody?
Yes, there are. There's this whole area of complexity around surrogacy, not only for same-sex couples, but particularly for same-sex couples, and also in relation to what's called parental responsibility for children. And this is something that the states are currently apparently considering. So things might change, but I think the difficulty is that in England and Wales, things seem to catch up much more quickly. So you had the original Children Act back in 1989, and our children law was years and years, decades later. So changes had been made in England and Wales that were not then made here because no one thought we need to double check what has changed. And that is often the story of our social legislation.
Which is interesting, where I could see for a whole range of reasons, and we'll come back to where we started with cohabitation, where perhaps people would assume a particular provision is in place because perhaps they've seen something on the news in England, and then suddenly there's a hole here, or it's not been updated since 1989.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. Another example, and again, we may refer to this when we look at children, is that under the children law in Jersey, step parents, whether it's they're same-sex or heterosexual, can't acquire what's called parental responsibility for children. And again, that's been raised several times. And again, apparently it's now being considered for a change.
Let's go right back to some of the practicalities that people can take away from this. As you speak to some of your clients who have been cohabiting and perhaps they've not realized they needed to check out this episode to realize, no, we need a provision in place. What sorts of troubles do you see? How difficult is that for them at, I guess, an already difficult time?
I mean, the most difficult area is when and if they buy property together. Now, that's made more complicated in Jersey by the fact that what very often happens is that the mortgage may be in the joint names of the couple, but the title to the property is in the name of just one of them because of the whole housing qualification argument. So in those cases, it's remarkable that even when people buy property, so they need a lawyer, the lawyer may well advise them that they need to draw up what's called an equity agreement, but often they think, oh, it's going to cost another £500, £700. We're always going to be together. There's never going to be a problem, so we'll leave it. And it's remarkable how many people don't protect themselves over what is this huge financial commitment.
And when you put that in perspective, that £500 to £700 versus a starter home in the low 100,000s, or we could be into seven figures and beyond, it seems really silly.
And then if you can't sort it out, then if you do need to go to court, you're talking about tens of thousands to sort it out. But I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier. People just don't think through. One, I think there is this slight misconception, common law marriage, as we said at the beginning, but people don't think we won't necessarily be together forever.
I'm going to ask you the question I asked at the start again, because I just want to reinforce it, because it is proper myth-busting territory. Is there such a thing in Jersey as common law marriage, advocate Rose Colley?
No, Gary Burgess, there isn't.
There, I think we cannot have said it clearer. In each of these episodes, I ask for your three top tips, and I've spotted some recurring themes as we go. So I can already guess what I think one might be, but you may surprise me. For someone who is cohabiting, for a couple who are cohabiting, your three top tips that they should really take note of today.
I think first tip is, even if you haven't bought anywhere together, think about doing a cohabitation agreement. Second big tip is that if you're going to buy property with someone, make sure not only the money you put in, but the eventual equity is properly protected, usually by way of an equity agreement. And thirdly, if you go on to have children together, you need to update potentially your cohabitation agreement or your equity agreement, or both.
Well, as always, valuable advice, Advocate Rose Colley from Viberts. Thank you so much. A pleasure as always. Join us next time when we're talking children on Holding Court, the Jersey Law Podcast.